Hey folks, Dave from Nerdarchy, for nerds, by nerds, and today I got Stanford in the house from Legendary Pants. By the way, I love that name. It's just fun to say. And primarily we're going to be talking about Core 2050, which is a futuristic version of 5e, a supplement that is now on Kickstarter, which you can find in a link to in the description, as well as social media, website, all that good stuff, folks. We will put it there for your convenience. How are you doing this afternoon?
Outstanding, Dave. How are you?
Good, good. And you're now one of my new favorite guests because you're a local guy.
Yes. We are also outside of Philadelphia, although on the Pennsylvania side of the river.
Yeah, that was perfect. That was perfect. Sorry. I don't. They say the same thing on the other side of the river anyway. So.
Right.
So, Legendary Pants is quite the interesting name. Let's start there.
Right. So the founder of our illustrious company here is my friend Rob, a friend of mine from college, who's actually my brother-in-law now, interestingly enough, but that's a whole nother story. He used to run a guild in WoW that did a lot of raiding, and their big joke was that at the time, and this was in vanilla WoW before Burning Crusade, that there were no legendary tier pants. So they would always have the joke like, oh, the boss dropped the legendary pants. So it was kind of a running gag through the guild. And then when we needed a name for the company, he said, well, let's just call it Legendary Pants. So that's what we did.
Cool. So WoW inspired.
Certainly we all got our start together playing WoW, back in 2004, 2005, back when the game first released. But we have since moved on.
And okay, someone's saying there's no video, but I see video on my end, folks, and I think other people are as well. We're just refreshing. That'll probably bring it back for you. So Core 2050, how did you guys come up with that? What's the elevator pitch? Why might folks be interested in this?
Sure. So Code 2050, and Core 2050 is actually the book itself. Code 2050 is the system that we wrote. Code 2050 is the our near future rule set extension for D&D 5e. Takes everything you love about Dungeons and Dragons, the monsters, the races, the adventures, and layers in a nice light layering of rules for modern day equipment, guns, computers, vehicles, as well as some more fun stuff like explosions, the occasional laser, hacking, things like that. So it basically allows you to play D&D and D&D feeling adventures but with near future technology.
Now, a couple folks brought this to my attention, and I actually reached out to you, which a lot of times with the Kickstarters it goes the other way around. But I was like, I started looking into it. I'm like, this is interesting. And a couple people came up to me like, hey, this looks like Shadowrun for 5, but with 5e. And I'm like, oh, well, you know what? Myself, like many other people, really thematically like the idea of Shadowrun, but then you get to the rules and it's kind of it's a whole nother beast unto itself. So that's kind of what got my interest. And then I also saw you're a local to us. So I was like, you know what? Let's get these folks on and talk to them and see what's going on over there.
Right, and it's funny you say that about Shadowrun because our kind of unofficial line on 2050, and the one we're not actually allowed to put in print, is that Code 2050 is basically Shadowrun, but the rules don't suck. It's a lot of the same kind of themes where you have those modern urban fantasy settings, magic and monsters, etc., but in a modern setting. However, we've taken the ease and simplicity and modularity of 5e, D25e, as opposed to the Shadowrun fistfuls of dice system.
So. Is it more about the rules or is it more about the setting?
So we have generated both. The system itself is more, of course, about the rules, making sure that you can add in these elements in a balanced way, so that people playing D&D don't feel like all of their knowledge and experiences in the game are now suddenly invalidated by all these new technologies and new rules. If you look in the vanilla DMG, you'll see that they have some guns kind of thrown in there as a suggestion. Those rules are terrible, and they're completely unbalanced. So we went in and just from the ground up designed a whole new system for all the guns, all the computers, and all that stuff in order to make sure that it plays in a balanced way and to make sure that it plays in a fun way, which, you know, the latter part of which is where Shadowrun kind of lost some of its steam. But then we also have created a setting, and the Kickstarter book has several, 150 pages of setting, and that setting is year 2050 in a near future Earth. But the premise is that magic has always existed. It's just relatively rare. It's not like a secret society kind of thing. It's always been around. It's just that, if 1 in 25,000 people even have the ability to become a level 1 adventurer, and only a half of them will ever cast a magic spell, it's just a very rare thing, but evenly spread around the world.
So how do you kind of handle that aspect? Like that's one of the areas that gets a little weird and wonky is when you take magic and bring it into the modern era. Why has technology advanced and people aren't just using magic instead? Do you guys go into that at all?
Yes, we do. So we have a little section about magic itself, and if you don't mind, I'll actually read a paragraph out of that. Magic is and has always been part of the world, but has never been common. Adventurers are as rare in 2050 as Olympic athletes or world-class concert musicians, and casters are only a percentage of that number. So if you look at that, yes, Olympic athletes exist, and everyone knows that they exist, but most people in the world will never actually meet one. So when you think about how rare magic is in our world, technology evolved to basically let non-magic people without access to magic, do the things that people with access to magic can't. We did our kind of pricing of what magic would cost in today's economy, and we've got it where like a level 5 spell slot is going to cost $500,000 per casting. So that's the kind of rarity we're talking about. So of course technology would still develop because not everyone has access to those kinds of funds and that kind of magic.
All right. Now I'm envisioning a group of gamers sitting in a room trying to figure out in today's economy what would a magic missile spell cost.
Absolutely.
And how did you guys come up with those numbers?
So we have a guy who is a statistician who works with us. He's in my regular Thursday group, and he does a lot of number crunching for scientific research. However, he said, okay, well, based on the numbers you've given me, the 1 in 25,000, half of which can cast a spell, he figured out how rare it was for a spell to exist in the entire world, and then priced it in comparison to some sort of Lamborghini. And I think he made it so that basically a level 6 spell slot was worth about this very specific kind of car, which is about like $2.5 million.
So now you're speaking to the nerd into me in me a bit here, and I start thinking, well, rarity is one way of gauging something, but value that doesn't necessarily make it valuable, right? Like, sure. It's depending on how useful something is, will determine value as well. Like, for instance, like what can you do with like a fireball, right? How useful is a fireball in everyday life? You don't often really need to blow things up in an uncontrolled way. So,
right. And so what we did actually was set a minimum and a maximum cost. So that way, yes, an individual spell at level 3 may only be worth, like a fireball, for example, is a level 3 spell. That is a very useful spell in like certain military applications, but agriculturally, a fireball spell is not going to really do much. It's just, not more than, a couple of road flares could pull off in setting a fire. So we have, for example, in the level 3 spell slots, the minimum costs about $3,000, where the maximum costs about $30,000. So the usefulness of the spell can still scale into that that spectrum.
We're getting a little off topic because it just makes me start thinking though, because some things like a low level spell like create food and water far more useful than higher level spells, like when you talk about practical application and things like that. But I'm going to pull back a little bit and dive back into the actual game. So is it what genre would you call this? Because is it cyberpunk? Is that what you're going for?
So our ultimate goal was to make sure that any kind of near future science fiction story, including cyberpunk, could be told with the rule set. There's often an assumption, especially when you look at things like Shadowrun and D&D to some extent, that the world is very homogenous. So the setting that you have in one part of the world is probably pretty much like the setting you have in another part of the world. And pardon me, we've got a motorcycle going by, so hopefully that's not too loud for you. So the planet is a big place, and even in today's non-fantasy setting, even in today's world, if you go to one country, you're going to have a very different feel for the culture and the politics and basically the society than you will in another country or in another country. And these can be countries separated by only a few hundred miles. So in our mind, the best way to set up a near future setting so that everyone has all the options they want is that we have geolocated certain kind of aspects. So if you go to Japan, for example, you have the Tokyo and Kyoto sprawl axis. That is, always raining, neon lit Asian Neo City cyberpunk setting right there. And you will always, and that's the kind of adventure you can expect to find there. Whereas if you go to France, which we did in our Coup de Monde season with Roll For It, it feels a lot more upbeat and a little more sort of like a John Scalzi novel. So a lot more, kind of speculative and a little more hopeful of the future.
So I know, like, when we played D&D Modern, like, they'd put out an Unearthed Arcana, and we just decided we wanted to play with it a little bit.
Sure.
And we did Nerdarchy Saves the World. And one of the problems or one of the issues that arose was, like, for the Warlock, he was far better off picking up an AK-47 and throwing grenades than he was at, casting spells.
Right. So part of the problem with that, and we did take a look at that on Unearthed Arcana because, of course we did. That's kind of our due diligence. Is that they way overcompensated the effectiveness of, for example, an AK-47 or a grenade as compared to the rest of the spells and equipment in the game. When you suddenly dial weaponry up, but don't comparably dial magic up, yes, an AK-47, I think in the D20 system was doing like 46 damage or something of that nature. And that much damage will, of course, outclass any kind of cantrip a Warlock can throw until level 18 or whatever when he gets his last cantrip buff. So what we did was keep all of the guns in line with the common weapons. And, my father, who's the other developer on this, he's actually in the Army. So when we talk about the efficacy of weaponry, he's got a lot of personal experience with that. And we went back and forth on it quite a bit. And finally, we settled on keeping all of the gun damages in line with regular D&D weaponry. That way the system stays balanced. So a Warlock can absolutely throw a pistol or wield a pistol and throw lead down range, but it's not going to be any more effective than him using, say, like a crossbow or a hand crossbow, whereas, his Eldritch Blast or, throwing a Witch Bolt or two would be obviously way more effective.
So do you guys go into the aspect of, like, cyberspace like you would in a cyberpunk game, or or we could jump into, like, how are you guys using the game?
Right. So I'll handle that cyberspace thing first. Obviously, one of our biggest influences here was William Gibson. Kind of the father of the cyberpunk novel. The funny thing about my father is he is in the Army and a programmer, so I have to be careful about guns and computers around that man. One of the important things we wanted to make sure, and this is again where I can critique Shadowrun, one of the important things we wanted to make sure was true was that everyone at the table could always have fun in any kind of adventure. So we were worried that if we made the computer rules too immersive or too engaging, that one player or two players who are hacking specific characters would have all this fun stuff to do, while the other players just get to watch them do that without really much going on. And when you look at like the Matrix rules in Shadowrun, that does happen quite a bit. And that's one of the bigger critiques of a system that's supposed to accommodate a 6 or 7 player team. Well, suddenly you've got a hacker doing all this stuff in the Matrix, and the other 5 or 6 people are doing nothing. So when we were looking at how to work the computer rules in with Dungeons and Dragons 5e, we made sure to keep it both feeling like 5e, so it's a lot of like skill checks and tool proficiencies, but also make sure that the rules are complex enough to be fun. So there's some skill checks and almost like a skill challenge kind of system, almost like 4e, but not so involved that the table has to come to a grinding halt whenever the hacker wants to access a computer.
It's kind of like the Starship Conundrum. And space combat, it's like, oh, do you want to be the, how do you make everyone useful and having fun in this group game?
Absolutely, and yes, space combat is the one area that tabletop RPGs have yet to pull off well. Or I'm sorry, and not just the combat itself, because the systems for that are fine, but just that the idea that you're taking a focus on characters and changing it to a focus on a single ship is a weird way to shift everyone's kind of psyche. And that's just like we do with computers. We need to make sure that everyone at the table has something to do and that it is fun. That's rule number 1. It needs to be fun.
It's like Voltron. No one wants to be the foot.
Yeah, exactly.
So now that brings us to the questions like, how are you using this system in your own games?
Right. So, interestingly enough, we have been doing a lot of modules for demonstration purposes and things like streams and stuff. I have played a little bit in my house, but not as much because most of my friends just want to play regular D&D. Totally fine. Not everyone's into the cyberpunk or the kind of guns and stuff. We like to run. So I have run both. A classic D&D adventure, but with Code 2050 rules. So you can do things where you're doing a dungeon crawl. We had a dungeon crawl in Roll For It where the team adventurers had to rescue a prisoner from a dungeon underneath a dragon's palace in Monaco. They had guns, they had computers and things, but they were fighting giant scorpions and goblins, and they were just doing a classic dungeon crawl. I also ran I ran a one-off where it was a straight up noir cyberpunk adventure in Tokyo, the Tokyo Kyoto axis, and they had to investigate. They were stealing something from a corporate guy. They got cheesed at the end, and their contact was killed, and they were poisoned, and it was crazy. But it was the same rule set, just in a different milieu. And I've done both pretty successfully.
Now, Josh wants to know, how do dragons manifest in the culture in this setting?
So dragons themselves are, of course, let me take a step back. The interesting thing about things like dragons and elves and other fantastical creatures is, of course, they have very long lives. We remember, even as I don't know how old you are or your audience is, but I am 33. So I remember things that my sister, who's just 18, does not remember. So imagine that difference when you're talking about creatures that are potentially 2,000 years old. So when we looked at where to place dragons in the world, we said, okay, well, they've been around for a long time. They're probably not great with technology, mostly out of a disinterest. Dragons by their very nature are insular. They don't like working together very well. So we basically put most of them in Africa in a loose political organization called the United Flights, because even though they don't really like working well together, they realized that in a globalized world, they needed to have some sort of cohesion, some sort of representation in the larger scheme of things, or else the humans would simply just come and kill them all. No matter how powerful a dragon is, eventually enough bullets will kill it. Dragons are not a mythos. They're not a mythological creature to the people in 2050. They're a real thing that you can go talk to, you can go treat with. So we had to make sure that the dragons were, politically savvy enough to exist without, kind of slipping into that like creature of antiquity.
Now, I must say, when you said United Flights, I just instantly thought of a airline, and then that brings to my mind, the fuselage of an airplane on the back of a dragon flying people around.
Yeah, I'm not sure they'd be too keen on that one, though. They're a little proud for that.
I imagine so. I just totally had a Flintstones moment. Cardboard Fortress. How does your system deal with huge drop off in theme, appropriate monsters available? Is it expected that you are mostly fighting leveled PC equivalents?
So that's a good question. It is not necessarily expected that, but keep in mind that we are going to... so all of the monsters and things from D&D do exist in some way, shape, or form in the world. There's also, the concept of the planes and things. So you can all absolutely have a 2050 adventure where you're fighting fire elementals and, bullets and things like that. If you're playing a more urban-based kind of cyberpunk noir, yes, there is an expectation that most of what you're going to be fighting are humanoids or, basically their pet dogs. We have included so we do have a set of monsters that we're including with the rule set that kind of, some new things, a mimic that looks like an ATM, a trash heap that has somehow gained enough oomph to go eat some stuff. But we've also decided to revitalize the old template system so that we will include a few templates that you can apply to existing D&D monsters in order to bring them more into Code 2050 themes. So a template for cybernetically enhanced monsters, a template for kind of radiation-based monsters, and things like that. So hopefully your adventures will not just feel, we're basically killing nameless suits all day, every day, and that's the entire adventure. Hopefully you can work in some variety using those tools.
So TrueMate wants to know, how does hacking work in the setting? Is it magical hacking or just two keyboard black coat hacking?
So we have both, actually. The primary technological way to hack is using, we leverage the tool proficiency to include a new tool called computers, although the rogue has a subclass called hacker, who can replace that with his hacking rig, which basically he can take expertise in and get bonuses, et cetera, et cetera. We have also included what I'm calling computer languages, which work just like language proficiencies. It's not really like a computer language like JavaScript or COBOL or something of that nature. It's more akin to knowing how to use and generally be comfortable with a Windows computer versus a Mac computer versus a Linux server, things like that. So if you're technologically hacking, you're basically just rolling skill checks. Okay, I would like to break into this computer. Okay, use your computer's tool proficiency with intelligence and roll a check. Okay, you got 15. You're in the computer. What do you want to do? And it'll be like a series of skill checks. Now, if you want to do magical hacking, so it's not the same thing. We already have in the game magic spells that allow you to do things to computers if you look at computers a little differently than most systems do. We are treating computers as constructs, which means that a computer has, as far as the system is concerned, a strength, a dexterity, a constitution, an intelligence, a wisdom, and a charisma, which allows us to say, okay, for all intents and purposes, a computer is a creature. You know, it's not a very mobile creature usually, but it is a creature. So if you understand the computer language that the computer's using, and you have a spell like suggestion, you can absolutely suggest to a computer to, you know, let you give you access for 8 hours. So that's where we're allowing for you know, these more traditional casters to still stay relevant in 2050
by letting them access their abilities on the future tech. Interesting.
Absolutely.
So Cardboard Fortress brings up a pretty interesting point. Not so much a question, but high-level monsters are easy to explain into a game. The lack of race and cultural things like... sorry, I jumped a bit. The lack of race and cultural things like goblins and orcs are a bigger issue to me. And, like, so how does the setting handle things like that? Orc tribes, goblin tribes, gnolls. You know,
Sure.
They're essentially, they're monsters. I would think people would want to wipe them out. You know, even gnolls
Right,
being
absolutely.
intelligent, they actually like to eat intelligent creatures to hear them scream. So, you know, it's like wiping out Nazis. No one's going to complain about that.
You're absolutely right. And yet, there are still Nazis in the world. So, it is an interesting point, and it's an interesting point because my father and I went back and forth on this a lot. We come from different generations. I'm, you know, of course, a millennial. He's a Gen X. So when I talk about the fact that, you know, calling an evil creature like kill on sight is kind of a crappy thing to do, and he's like, well, it's a goblin. You're going to kill it. That's what you do. So we have worked out such that, you know, yes, if you're going to be very aggressive and going to be very violent, generally you're not going to have a good time in a civilized society. But there are plenty of places in the world where that's not as strictly regulated. So we do have, and in our setting, we actually have, you know, dossiers, for lack of a better term, on, you know, these kind of more violent races. We have the unaligned orc tribes. This is a set of tribes of orcs that are basically, they stay away from a lot of society in order to, you know, survive, because they know if they got too violent and started raiding, that people would just, you know, band together and kick their asses. However, they are still technologically savvy enough to hook up to the internet and take mercenary contracts. And so, you know, there are maybe companies of mercenary orcs that, you know, countries will kind of send toward a problem and hope that the problem goes away. Races that are a little more, that are evil, but a little more conniving or cunning, things like kobolds and goblins, they're absolutely in society. Yeah, they're selfish dickheads most of the time. I don't know what our language limit here is on your channel, actually, so I should...
Sorry.
But, you know, while the kobolds may be evil in a classic sense, they're great tunnelers. So why not use them to build a subway system? You know, as long as you're paying them and they're happy enough, they'll do it. Maybe they'll leave, you know, little traps and things because they're kobolds, but, you know, that's just something you expect and pay to clean up afterwards.
Cost of doing business.
Exactly.
I used to work in road construction, and sometimes they would run over, right? They get fines $10,000-$20,000, but it was just like, okay, but startup for a night's $10,000 anyway. So if they can push through and get done, I just think that's funny. Cost of doing business with kobolds.
Absolutely. So yeah, and that's where we try not to leave too much up to kind of GM fiat, but it's absolutely up to the GM how a specific society views these kind of more traditionally monstrous races.
So, and the other thing too, even like, you know, you brought up, well, they're still Nazis, but there's a huge difference, like when you can line up 10 people and go, that's a Nazi, but you can't really do that, right? When you go, that's a hyena guy that probably wants to eat my face. We could probably just exterminate those guys. So, no one's going to feel sympathy. Maybe PETA, I don't know. Oh, what have you done with organizations? What does PETA look like? I would have a lot of fun with this. People would hate me.
Yeah, PETA. So, and when you think about that too, you know, you can't assume that. So if you took an organization like PETA and said, okay, now there are hyena people. Well, you know, they're animals, but also people. But you gotta remember that, you know, this is a world where the hyena people, you know, those are the gnolls, have always existed. So the concepts of like racial segregation and kind of human animal hybriding and whatnot are a little different when you look at it in that light. Skin color is probably not as big of a deal when it's still humans and then some big dragonborn people. So it is racial tensioning is kind of a sensitive area that we don't talk about too much, mostly because we won't want to tread on that too harshly. But our basic assumptions are that people are assholes to each other. So why would the world be terribly different if there were some different people involved? You can already see the worst in people when there are only humans. So we don't think it would be drastically different if there were also other sentient races.
That creates some interesting questions, but I see if you look at that as humans, when we're just be able to, oh, that person looks different than us, and then the horrible things we've been able to justify, when you go, that thing actually doesn't even look human. I can just imagine, how much worse we would be as a people to that. But how do you guys treat like history, in the setting? Did you come up with a whole history? Do you follow, closer to like a fantasy world moving it forward, or do you look at the real world and go, well, how would these different things unfold with these, fantastical elements?
So when I said earlier that we spread magic out, so magic is rare and evenly spread, what that allows us to do is take a little bit of a shortcut. Because instead of, so Shadowrun, for example, takes a different shortcut where everything is the same until was it 97, 98, and then suddenly the event occurs and everything is different. So that let them, take that kind of shortcut. The shortcut we take is that everything is the same. It's just that magic has always been there. So you look at something like a battle in World War One, or actually World War II might be a little better because small arms are a bigger deal. How would a battle in World War II have been different if there was suddenly magic introduced? Well, not a lot different, because there's the same amount of magic on both sides of the conflict. So yes, instead of simply machine guns and and artillery, there might be the occasional fireball and magic missile, but they're going both directions. So the overall balance of the war itself is not going to change drastically because there is now magic, because the Germans had just as much access to magic as the Americans did. So we're we imagine these kind of like artistic renderings of older pictures where instead of these 4 American soldiers putting up the flag at Iwo Jima, one of them just happens to be a tabaxi, for example. The history is still valid. The balance of history is still valid. It's just now, in those historical moments, there was some of these fantastical elements.
So TrueMate has a question. Are there any defining historical events in the history of Core 2050?
So when we look at defining historical events, we have to look at, as I just said, we basically maintained all of history as it is today. So the big historical events are going to happen between 2018 and 2050. There's only 30 some odd years. There aren't any cataclysmic world-ending things. We kind of kept things the way they seem to be going now. The climate's getting a little warmer. Some countries are getting very wealthy, others are getting very poor, things like that. The biggest kind of technological breakthroughs are in the areas of cybernetics, because obviously we have to have cybernetics. It can't be near future without it. And construction, because and we're almost there. Oh, and like self-driving cars and things like that. So a little bit of AI as well. But in the areas of construction, we're almost there today, where a relatively small crew of people can throw up a concrete building in a few hours or a few days using 3D printing techniques. So in 10, 20 years, if we develop a way that a drone, a sufficiently advanced AI drone fleet could throw up a skyscraper in a month, you're talking about an incredible boom to urban expansion. And that's where you start getting things like the Japanese sprawl, and we have some sprawl sprawl being those kind of like classic cyberpunk cities. We have some sprawl in Europe and some sprawl in America that we detail. But that's the big kind of technological advances that have shaped what we know today into what we are presenting in 2050.
So, will I see things like like the boardroom beholder?
So beholders themselves, maybe not. They're an interesting case, and we're not actually allowed to print any of those because they're super copyrighted. But we absolutely have situations where a dragon could control a company. There's no reason that can't be the case. I've actually kind of done some thought experiments about what if we have a company that's actually controlled from the plane of fire in the city of Brass. Those sorts of things are not only possible, they're likely because there are companies owned by almost everyone, so why not a company owned by these fantastical creatures?
Absolutely. So are there like iconic NPCs or organizations that you guys introduced with 2050?
We're trying to keep the setting as kind of clean slate as possible. We have introduced a few companies. The big one is Barlow Nucleosystems, which does like kind of bioengineering. And we've done some adventures in those. This is the core rulebook, so most of the analysis of like key NPCs and important companies and things we'll get into when we start doing adventures themselves, when we start publishing adventures.
Cool. So have you guys made any rounds to any cons or?
The big con that we had a showing at was PAX Unplugged last year. We ran 3 tables all weekend. We must have run 15, 16 games of our kind of demonstration module, Best Served Cold, and we had a great time. We are planning on being at a bunch of cons in the fall, including PAX Unplugged again. Although we will actually have a booth at PAX Unplugged rather than sneaking into the free play area and throwing up our sign and hoping no one noticed. So yes, we will. Our con showing will be much heavier in the coming days, and actually in Harrisburg in October. There's a con called Save Against Fear that LP is sponsoring, so we will definitely be there in a large force in a few months.
So, what kind of feedback did you get from your Guerrilla Playtests?
Almost universally positive. A couple critiques here and there. The feedback we were mostly getting is, "Wow, this feels like D&D," which is perfect feedback because that was the point. I had a lot of tables who. One of the kind of the things we were trying to demonstrate was that a player who has played 5e can sit down and play Code 2050 with almost no prep work because they already know how to play. All of the core tenets are already there. So we got a lot of that feedback. People, they liked the adventure we wrote, so I guess that was on us. But as far as the system goes, I have not had a serious fault in the system come forward yet through our playtesting. So I think the system itself is pretty sound.
Nice. And how, I don't think I've asked this yet, but how long have you guys been working on it?
So we originally started working on the concept back in 2014, but we were originally going to develop it for Osric before D&D Next even really kind of came out. Once 5e came out, was published, and became probably the most popular RPG system that's ever been created. We kind of shifted gears from that, AD&D classic sense to the 5e. In steady development, 2.5 years.
Okay, cool. So, what is the thing that excites you the most about bringing 2015 out into the world?
So when I first saw Shadowrun back in 2003, 2002. I fell in love with the world immediately, which I think a lot of people do. Shadowrun's world is very compelling. And I'm very excited to be able to present that kind of feeling to players and have a rule set that actually works. I am personally a mechanics guy. I love designing systems, and I'm really excited that we have managed to produce, that same kind of feeling of that fantastical, science fiction fantasy mashup, but in a way that's approachable and playable and accessible to people who may actually want to play that, but just simply don't have the time, the patience, or the ability to find a Shadowrun group to play.
What were some of the key beats that you felt like you had to hit in order to make it feel like Shadowrun without it being Shadowrun?
So and that's where, because we usually get the so is this just Shadowrun for 5e? And the short answer is yeah, but don't tell anybody. We, it's important to hit those markers of, okay, so we've got computers and they run everything. There are guns everywhere, but one of the ways we kind of deviate a little bit is that we do not require a team of adventurers to be illegal like they do in Shadowrun. I mean, that's the name of the game, Shadowrun. They're running the shadows. Adventurers are a legal entity in Code 2050. So, we hit a lot of those markers in order to kind of, show, yeah, you can play, those Cyberpunk games here. We have all of the equipment you need. We have all of the rules you need to run them. But we are not the same. We are definitely not the same. And here are some ways that we are different. Adventuring is legal. We're a lot more diverse in our fantastical ecology, things like that. So our goal was to have a similar emotional feel to Shadowrun without being the same. And the ways we are different, we like to think we are better.
So, of the people that are playing 2050, have you seen any of them play it in unexpected ways?
So I don't know if it's we need a better feedback system, but we are not getting a crazy amount of feedback from players. I'm hearing about players playing it and they're saying, yeah, it's great, but then they don't go into detail. I don't know if this is common in the development cycle. I would not be surprised because people are always reticent to provide good, strong feedback. So I have not found anything unexpected yet, but I'm sure they're going to. The closest thing I've got is that one guy wants to take the rules we've created and project them another 100 years into the future and run kind of like an Aeon Flux sort of scenario. So that kind of future punk dark campaign.
Dystopian.
And that sounds like. Yeah, so that sounds like a lot of fun, but he hasn't started yet, so I don't know how that's turning out yet.
So a suggestion from chat is got to ask play testers how it made them feel. Gets much better answers.
Okay, yeah.
You guys have a Discord up, you have the website up, and actually people can check out the rules for free, right? From the website or the Kickstarter?
Yes, so we have a selection of rules. So the rules themselves for the system are going to be OGL'd from the get-go. We have a selection of them up on the website now, but they're from an earlier version. So we are still, we're still making sure that everything's finalized before the Kickstarter is done. So we will, at the end of the Kickstarter, have the full, rule set for the OGL. And up on the website. One of the things we are not publishing right now are all of the subclasses. We have 36 new subclasses in this edition, which is, I believe, the thickest population of subclasses outside of the original player's handbook. We have not published all of those because we're keeping some of those close to the vest. We published bits and pieces of them, but we LP does expect to maintain a fair amount of copyright on the setting and some of the Code 2050 kind of branded things. But the rules themselves are up there. So if you wanna take your D&D game and play it today, you could go do that.
So looking at the Kickstarter, you guys are like a sixth of the way there. You got 14 days to go. Do you have a backup plan? Because you guys kind of a long road to hoe still.
yeah, long in journey, but not in time, unfortunately.
Yeah.
One of the things that LP is trying to do, and this is our first Kickstarter, so we're learning a lot, and we know where we misstepped, and we're working to correct it, but it's it's a slow process. So hopefully we're hoping that everything will work out okay. We'll hit that 30K and we'll be good to go. But if we don't, one of the things LP is making sure to do is that we are going to produce content for Kickstarter where the content is ready when the pledges are in and done. So 2050 as a rule set, the setting, things like that are 96% done. We will be done when the Kickstarter, so a couple weeks into June. If the Kickstarter fails, which I'm going to be honest is relatively likely at this point, we will still have a product. A lot of the cost in there is coming from things like art. Art is expensive. Printing books is expensive. So we're trying to decide whether or not we will simply, produce the PDF and just go to direct sales, or if we'll try another Kickstarter at a lower tier where it's just digital content, things like that. But the, Code 2050 will exist whether or not this Kickstarter succeeds.
I will say, I mean, we get a lot of Kickstarters on here, and you never know, because I have seen some Kickstarters that kind of start off slow, and then something happens, and and they pick up a lot of momentum, and they do end up kicking. And it's not unheard of. I've also seen people relaunch with some tweaking and streamlining. Friends of ours just actually did that, and and it kicked pretty quickly. After they did that. So I mean, it's definitely not the end of the road, and there are other options. But just looking at the numbers as they are right now, I'm curious. But I'm still happy to have you on here and bring attention to the project, regardless of whether it kicks or not, so that hopefully people will be following, whether it kicks, they can get their stuff, or, to see what you guys do in the future.
Right, and that's where we did, and when I talk about a big misstep, that was our misstep. So when we sat down to really analyze what we were going to do for this Kickstarter, I did all this research on shipping and fulfillment and all this research on costs, and we got the numbers so well down that if we hit our goal, we have not lost any money, which is apparently relatively unusual for Kickstarters, because there's a lot of unexpected costs that people don't plan for ahead of time. So we nailed the math on this, and where our product is done, it's good, it's going to be good to go. What we didn't know about, and therefore didn't do properly, was the social media aspect. So at the beginning of the show, you said usually people ask you to go on the show. I should have done that a month ago, but I did not, because that is a part of this that we are all brand new to. And we brought on someone to manage our social media, but we did it like 6 months too late. So we're trying to play that kind of, Twitter catch-up game now, and it is working, but I don't think it's going to work fast enough at this rate. So hopefully, at the very least, we have learned that lesson. And after this Kickstarter, if it does go into the dirt, then we will at least have a solid core of followers who are ready for the next one. And we can work on that campaign a little earlier than 2 weeks before the kick.
Well, hopefully it will come to that. But like I said, it's we are literally looking at our own Kickstarter, and that was one of the things that we looked at. It was like, I would rather see this thing burn to the ground than lose money on doing a Kickstarter, and disappoint people and not create the best product we could possibly create. So there's definitely no shame in that. And like I said, the Kickstarter is great for just getting out there and getting your name out there. So you're doing that now. And when you go forward, you know where you made missteps, and you can just correct.
Yeah, it turns out all we really needed to do was just take a note from Kraken and just make dice, because apparently you can make all of your money on dice.
Dice are a big seller.
Yeah, so I think our next Kickstarter might just be dice with a side of Code 2050 rule PDFs thrown in.
Are you sure you don't want to make potato salad?
Oh, potato salad, yeah. Everyone at the $3 mark on the potato salad gets a free PDF.
That's funny. Yeah, well, these are the lessons we learn. So Are you you said in your own group, are you playing Core 2050? You're playing something else? You mix it up? You said a lot of your friends still want to play, basic fantasy.
Yeah, so we're still struggling through Tales from the Yawning Portal. We in my Thursday group, so this is my weekly D&D group. We started Tales from the Yawning Portal like the week after it came out, and our idea was, okay, we'll run a dungeon, and then the next dungeon we'll switch a DM, and we'll do it again. And so we're in the we're in the 6th dungeon of this module. We're almost out of it. We got like another 2 weeks. It has been the better part of a year and a half that we've been running this dungeon. And, I'm a big story guy. I'm a big, social and exploration aspects. This dungeon crawling for every week for a year has been hard on my soul, and I am excited to get out of it. But that's what we've been mostly playing right now is the WotC hardcovers, because and everyone's experience is a little different, but my weekly group is full of people who have day jobs, so we don't always have time to prep, a homebrew campaign or something a little more complex. So we generally on the Thursday in our Thursday group run the WotC hardcovers. So we'll be out of this one soon. We'll be in Tomb of Horrors, and hopefully we'll be done with that before the new hardcover in November.
And we'll all be dead, but
which is fine.
Yeah,
it'll be a nice change of pace.
Yeah, well, I guess Tomb of Annihilation might not be your thing either. Then, well, I guess that's a lot of exploration.
Yeah, so I ran Tomb of Annihilation in a monthly group, although some personal issues fell and like half the party dropped, so we kind of stopped. They had gotten to like level 4 or 5. I loved Tomb of Annihilation's concepts, their cores, their exploration, their hex crawling could have been done better. But again, I'm such a mechanics builder that I think of different ways to do that. But Tomb of Annihilation was a good time. It was a fun setting, because usually you're in this kind of pseudo European medieval setting, but now we got kind of thrown into the jungle, and it was a lot of fun.
Nice. So when you're like running through these adventures, are you taking notes for 2050? Like, how would I do this in a modern setting or futuristic?
Absolutely. And a lot of it is, and this is going to sound callous, but I'm allowed to talk about myself like this. Usually what I do is I take a look at, what did this hardcover do poorly and how would I fix it? Because, like I said, the hex crawl system was not great. So I take my hard drive is filled with PDFs of books I will never actually play, but ones that I have read and in order to do research for Code 2050 and our other projects. And the tabletop genre, the tabletop environment has always taken cues from one another. The old-fashioned, well, if you find a good idea, just steal it. Obviously we have to be a little more careful about that when we're an official publisher, but it is certainly true that taking good ideas and building upon them, or taking poor ideas and fixing them, is a great developmental tool, and one that I employ.
So when I had a question. I just lost it. Sorry, it happens often. I was also looking in the chat, and I get easily distracted.
Yes, I had to turn chat off so that I would not be.
It's part of my job to keep it on, so that's kind of the thing. So, what kind of directions would you want to take 2050 in? Have you looked at things like, obviously, it's planar in nature, right? But if we're talking like futuristic setting, like what other kinds of like sci-fi elements would you want to bring into it? Like aliens, extraterrestrials, that kind of stuff.
So we haven't really talked too much about aliens because we're trying to stay near future instead of those kind of like far future, faster than light travel, things like that. We have talked vaguely about this is 30 years from now. It is conceivably possible that there's a few people living on Mars at this point. How are things different on Mars than they are on Earth when you're also looking at these kind of fantastical elements? Does magic in orbit work the same way you expect it to on Earth, or not, and how? it's funny because originally my idea was, you know what, magic is probably relatively bound to the planet you're on, so it might change from planet to planet. And then I heard Spelljammer was a thing, and apparently that's like their entire premise. I have not played Spelljammer, but you know that's basically the core tenet of the system. So obviously we're thinking about that, but we're probably not going to put a whole bunch of habitation outside of like near Earth orbit kind of things.
You know, we've talked about magic, but I guess one of the areas we haven't talked about really is like divine magic and theology and how that operates. Sure. You know, in faith, how that operates in a world where the gods can directly manifest themselves, and that's
Absolutely.
something that's not in Shadowrun.
Right. So my father and I belong to an older school of thought, and I'm not sure if this is still kind of mainstream in D&D or not, that a god's power is derived from people who believe in him, not the other way around. So what we have done is said, okay, we're on Earth 2050, and there are plenty of books and fiction that do this kind of thing. But basically, if there are enough people that believe in a god or a deity, he is real as far as the D&D metaphysics are concerned. So what that does is, yes, you know, if you want to play a cleric, you can be a cleric of, you know, Jesus or Allah or Yahweh or some of those kind of Judeo-Christian elements. You could also be a Hindu cleric, where you have several, you know, a polytheistic environment. But you can also go back further in history. I had a cleric of Apollo play in one of my last campaigns. So he was, you know, very much about, you know, the light, and Apollo was, you know, he was a light domain cleric. So, you know, very much about light, and he worshipped the sun and refused to wear sunglasses, and the whole thing. So yes, so the gods do exist, and, you know, they're out there, but their influence, their power and stuff is based on how many people, you know, are worshipers and followers of them.
I also wonder, like, if you go with that principle, how many new religions kind of spring up based on if you have enough people that believe in it, whatever that number is. Does it, you know, what happens to the David Koreshes of the world when you implement that kind, you know, that kind of system?
Right, or the Jim Jones, or
yeah.
So yeah, and that's not something we're going to codify, because that's going to cause some arguments on the internet. But what is that follower like threshold? Where's the point where you go from, you know, I'm just a dude who's really charismatic to I'm actually, you know, a divine being at this point? And, you know, I don't know the answer to that.
Like how many people in your cult has to sacrifice themselves so that when you do, you kind of go right to being a fiend, you know, instead of, or maybe you just come back as undead. I'm not sure, you know.
Yeah, and is it like a spectrum? Do you get the water to wine thing first and then the, you know, walking on water, or is it all at once you hit that threshold, you know?
So James Leslie wants to know, are you hoping 2015 will just be a starting point and expand to other genres like sci-fi or horror? Or is the long-term goal to make a 2015 universe? And will there be more dice?
There will be more dice. We actually just paid for our molds yesterday, so our dice are coming. So your answer actually has a yes to both. I do plan on expanding past 2050. We have some other projects in the pipes that are not 2050 related, but are, you know, kind of more general D&D related. I would love, and this is probably hubristic on my part, I would love to fix far future space crawl tabletop RPGs, because I have never seen one do it right. And I'm, you know, we're already failing as a Kickstarter, so I'm bold enough to say this. Starfinder has not proven nearly as fun as everyone was expecting it to be when it was, you know, being hyped up, and a lot of that is because Far Future takes a different feel to the game than, you know, playing something like Pathfinder or D&D. So I want to say I can, again, hubris, I think I can fix it. I don't have time to fix it, so I don't know when or if that's going to happen, but that's something I would like to do. That's in, you know, kind of the dream. For 2050 itself, once this core book is out there and we have some people, we do plan on publishing full campaigns, like level 1 to 15 campaigns for it. Supplemental material, so something that goes a little further into the technological aspects of the world. Things like new classes, which we didn't do any new classes for this book because we're trying to keep it so 5e centric. We would like to expand to a couple new classes, and take the world and flesh it out. That is our overall goal for 2050 itself.
So, I mean, recently there's been a couple D&D sci-fi games that come out. I have not looked at them extensively. There's Hyperlanes, Espergenesis is another one. Espergenesis,
I have. It's all right. I don't want to. Espergenesis did some cool stuff, and they deserve credit for that. They didn't. I don't feel like they fixed some of the things that far future tabletop RPGs generally have an issue with. But the system itself is pretty good. I like it. I've not heard of Hyperlanes.
Yeah, and I feel like there are some other ones too that I'm not thinking of as well.
Right.
So there's definitely a lot of stuff out there to take a look at, and people are doing different things differently, and that's kind of like cool about the hobby in general, though. Is like
Absolutely.
You get to put your spin on it and figure out how you think it should work. And with the OGL, we do get some freedom to actually explore that and experiment with that. So I'm curious to see where things go and continue to grow. Curious to see what you guys continue to come up with. We are, coming up to the end here of the hour. So, folks, if you haven't gone over to the YouTube channel, we are giving away like 5 copies of Mordenkainen's Tome of Foes, 3 special edition, 2 regular edition. So there's a video there. You guys can go watch it and check that out and enter that competition that's going to be going on until like the end of the month. With that, let me turn it over to you, Stanford, and parting words.
So you can find us at legendarypants.net and on Twitter. That's our kind of main social output right now is at legendary_pants. Come back to Kickstarter, code 2050. We're out there. Other than that, stay you. We're loving the audience outreach, and we're loving this hobby. So keep at it.
And also, folks, if you're here for Spelljammer, it is coming up next. Within the next 20 minutes or so, we have Ingest Quest will be in the house with Doug at the helm. So thanks everyone for watching. Thanks for hanging out. Thanks for coming on, Stanford. And with that, until next time, everyone, stay nerdy.
Thank you very much.